All right, good morning, everybody. I'm Chris, and you're listening to Into the Cauldron. I am here today with an up-and-coming author, Ben Stimpson, to tell you all about his new book, and we are going to be talking all about traditional witchcraft, ancestor veneration, mystery schools, probably,
Probably mystery schools.
and a whole bunch of other stuff. So, Ben, thank you so much for coming on, man.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for inviting me on. I'm really looking forward to our chat today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so I mean, for those of you who don't know you, yeah, and for those of you who don't know your work, we were having a little chat sort of before I hit record on this, and Ben's doing what sounds to be an absolutely amazing book on ancestor veneration that's coming out soon. So Ben, for those of you who don't know you,
Yes.
well, where do we start with your stuff?
Absolutely. Well, so Cole's notes. I'm actually originally from the UK. I was born in North Wales. I moved to Canada when I was 8 years old. So I've been in Canada for about 25 years now. I don't look like it, but I have been over here 25 years. And I'm kind of all over the place. So a lot of people in the North American kind of spiritual pagan magic community know about me or know of me. And I'm starting to make inroads, building connections in the UK. So I'm not even sure where to start, really. Where do you want to start?
Well, let's go with your new book to start with. I mean, we were talking about it before. It was, I think you said about sort of the main focus is about ancestor veneration, right? And it's more kind of general as opposed to something like leading into hoodoo or things like that or anything like that, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, a little bit of a backstory on that. So I've been practicing witch. I've been practicing pagan since I was a teenager, and from that I branched out and started exploring other traditions. And spirits are notorious for kind of pulling people into their orbit. So about 7 years ago now, I started working with a group that was very interdisciplinary, people from all sorts of different backgrounds. And I was pulled into the orbit of a Lukumi practitioner, a crowned priest of Oshun in the Lukumi tradition. Lukumi is Santeria, that's another name for it, Afro-Cuban tradition. And at that point in my life, I was kind of in transition. I seem to always be in transition every 2 years, so it's kind of a weird thing in my life. And one of the basic kind of foundational pieces are around Lukumi and Espiritismo, which is spiritualism, Caribbean spiritualism, is working with one's ancestors, muertos, egun. And there's a common kind of way of looking at the universe in this way of locating us as living beings. We're in the center. We have the ancestors beneath us. We have the Orisha, the spirits, the gods around us, and then there's God above us. And so we're located in the center, not as the center, but we're located surrounded by this web of being. And so I started working on my connection with my ancestors, because ancestors and ancestry has always been a huge part of my life. Coming from the UK at such an early age, I was literally disconnected from both the place of where my origin point, but also all my ancestors. It wasn't like I could go easily to a cemetery and see my dead relatives. A large part of my family remained in the UK, and so it was just us. It was my core family over here. So growing up in a very small rural Ontario in Canada town here, where everybody was related to each other in some way, I very much felt left out, and I didn't know really how to connect. That was part and parcel of my spiritual journey, reconnecting with my own kind of British identity around 13, 14, reconnecting with my ancestral identity, who am I? Because I was so different from everybody over here, kind of snowballed. And then when I met my godfather, and he really got us to work on working with our ancestors and building that ancestral connection. That's really where it snowballed. So from that, I saw that there was a need, because I noticed that many people in the pagan spiritual, like North American, and I say in the UK as well, community has such an interest in their ancestors, but because of religious trauma, coming away from, say, Christianity or more dominant kind of cultural traditions, there's no understanding of how to connect with those ancestors. How do you connect with ancestors who are of a different religion than you, or that belonged to this religion that you may have had trauma from, that you were actively rejecting? What can often happen is, the old idea of, oh, well, my pagan ancestors from 2,000 years ago, right? Which is nothing wrong with that, but that speaks to a disconnection. And so I was looking at a lot of the material that is geared towards kind of white people, I would say. And undoubtedly, a lot of it is either giving you a tradition to follow. This is a way that you can go forward with this, or it heavily relies on looking at traditions like hoodoo or the African traditional religions, or even sometimes looking at like Chinese, Japanese animism and connecting that way. There's very little about how to develop a practice for yourself using your own ancestral traditions, even just a pep talk. So really my book is a pep talk. It is a challenge. It is a series of essays connected to certain parts of ritual and spiritual practice more generally, to get people to start to think about and take ownership of their spiritual practice, as opposed to just taking from other cultures or something that is given to them, because that then isn't really, you're not in relationship to your own ancestors. You're in relationship to, Coco's ancestors or, something, right?
Mm. Yeah,
So
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of I actually came back from gosh, this was I think a month and a half ago. I was at a festival here in England, down in Reading, actually. Not Reading Festival, but a different kind of festival. The Reading Festival. It was in Reading. And they were they brought together a lot of kind of indigenous shamans or different kinds of figures, mainly to talk on things like decolonialization, different kinds of stuff like that.
Yes.
And I remember one of the talks I went to that was really, really interesting, was really empowering, was around the use of the word like shaman or healer and stuff like that, and a lot of how a lot of indigenous traditions don't like the word because it's kind of been appropriated from, I think it's mainly Siberian or Mongolic word for it. Yeah. But one of the discussions that we ended up having about this whole thing was really interesting. It was like one of the best things you can do as a kind of, I mean, in a way, it feels similar to what you're saying, but like a re-indigenization of yourself. And it's like you need to go back to your own roots, your own land, your own connections, that kind of thing. And that's kind of what I think also partly defines traditional witchcraft as well, because traditional witchcraft is so regional as well. But one of the things that we talked about that was so amazing for me was using or identifying yourself using a word in sort of what your native ancestral language would be, or connecting back to it. So rather than calling yourself a shaman or an ancestor worker or a healer or whatever it is, go back to whatever your indigenous language is and find the word for mystic or witch or healer, whatever word that your ancestors used, and reclaim that and see how that resonates, see how that feels. Because again, it's a form of re-empowerment or re-indigenization for yourself.
Absolutely.
Rather than drawing from tons of different traditions all over the place that make no sense and no practical reason to you. So I think even in this vein of it, if we were to bring that in, like ancestral veneration really is almost like a cornerstone of practical like experience. I think that really a lot of people, or if they're working with people, go to work with spirits outside of maybe, I don't know, like land spirits or anything like natural spirits. I think probably ancestors are one of the first things or entities that people will come across, right?
Absolutely. Oh, there were so many things I wanted to pick up on what you just said. I have to be honest.
Yeah, let's do it.
So the first piece around that re-indigenization. So I totally agree with you, and whoever the speaker was, I'm sure I would agree with a lot of what they have to say. That is a huge kind of approach now in North America, especially for settler culture. This idea of, you're living in this land, your ancestors have lived in this land for 200 years, but it's not your ancestral land. And this causes a lot of problems. I see it when and not bash Celtic festivals. I don't know if you've ever encountered.
Oh yeah, no, don't worry. I think I'm probably going to agree on whatever you're about to say.
It's very strange, especially as so like I said, I feel like I'm always in a transition in my life. Something I've identified, and this kind of happened subconsciously. A lot of the deities I work with, Shiva, Hermes, Oshun, I don't work with Oshun, but I was under her tutelage for a long time. They're deities of change. And I've noticed that a lot in my life, is I'm always kind of in between spaces. So I'm always like perpetually, I'm always in the mid-Atlantic, because I've got one foot in North America and one foot back home, right? So when I came over here, I see these Celtic festivals, and I think it was, who was it? Oh, Rhys Griffith. He came over and he did like a tour of Canada recently, and he went to one of these Highland festivals, and he said, "Wow, they're more Scottish than Scottish people are, right?" There's this weird thing about people who have like Scots-Irish ancestry. They so connect with that ancestry. They so connect with that identity that that's their identity, right? But when you go to these festivals, it's all from 200 years ago. It's the culture that it was from 200 years ago, and then it's kind of placed over kind of modern UK, modern Scotland, modern Wales, whatever, right? So there's a definite wanton drive, but this causes an issue, because when somebody is so connected with a homeland that is only in their memory, only in their kind of cultural memory, right? They're not connecting with the land that they're on now in an authentic way. And so, this idea of settler culture, it causes a weird sense of, in and out, like, are we here? Are we not here? Do we have a right to be here? Do we not have a right to be here? And who gets lost in all of that are the indigenous people whose ancestors have a connection with this land going back 40,000 years, right? Or 20,000 years. So it's a very weird sort of situation. And I feel like actually in the UK, a similar thing happens, because so many people have now mixed ancestry. Like I have in the past 4 generations, Cornish, Devon, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and England, all in that one makeup, right? Like my great-grandfather was from all the way up John o' Wick. My other great-grandfather was all the way down in Cornwall, right? They met in the middle of Manchester. So it's a weird thing with identity politics of like the need to almost choose one identity and then be that. I'm also seeing now that, as you were saying, that reclaiming of not just a single identity, but an understanding of those multiple identities through that one lens of, say, reclaiming a word for a practitioner. My friend Mara Starling, who came out with a Welsh Witchcraft book last year, and she's great, she's amazing. She talks a lot about this, about how she's not a witch. She's a Welsh speaker. She grew up on Anglesey, and she's not a witch because in Welsh culture, which is really tied to the language, the traditional word would be in Swynraig, right? That has a slightly different connotation from the English witch, and so her practice is different from kind of English witchcraft. Very similar in many ways, but there's that nuance, right? And so I feel like the way forward, as you pointed out, right, the way forward, I think, for people is to both reclaim their own indigenous identity, but also understand, especially in the North American context, that there's also this concept of indigenization, which is not becoming indigenous. It is creating a new connection with the land that also includes the indigenous people's connection with that land. Robin Wall Kimmerer, who created a wonderful book, Braiding Sweetgrass, I really, really highly recommend that for people, speaks a lot about this and how settler kind of, I'm not even sure what the word would be, how settler apprehension of connecting with the land is actually causing more ecological damage, because there's a sense that, yes, my ancestors built this town, we've been here since the Mayflower came over, but we don't actually belong here because really our homeland is over there. I'm Scottish, right? Well, no, you're not Scottish. You're Scottish descended, but you're not Scottish, right? And that's okay. You don't need to be Scottish to be anybody. You can be yourself, but you can connect with that heritage in an authentic way and take ownership. I speak a lot about that in the book, taking ownership of your spirituality, taking ownership of your relationships. And it's all about relationship, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, cultivating relationship. Absolutely, it's one of those things. Because it's actually pretty funny when I think about it. Even in my own life and my own practice, a lot of my it's kind of weird because it's a big theme, I think, especially in like past, I don't know, 5-10 years, like people getting like DNA tests or whatever to like trace their ancestry, whether they're doing ancestry or it's on like 23andMe and all that kind of thing. And I remember doing, I think it was 23andMe like a couple of years ago, and I basically like did the whole thing and basically just found out that I'm basically just very, very British. Like I have like no other ancestry anywhere. It's like all like basically it's like 95% British, and I think like 5% like Alpine Celtic, like French, German maybe. But what was really interesting, and I actually went back through like my grandparents and stuff, like I went and talked to some of them or some of my aunts and uncles and stuff, and they kind of confirmed this whole thing. But a lot of my family for the past like 4 or 5 generations, or it might even be like 3 or 4 generations, something, they live sort of like in the north of England, so sort of around like Yorkshire, York, that kind of area. But originally I think it was my grandfather's family was from like south in Kent, which is where I'm actually living now. So he was actually, and he's actually really interesting because his whole family was from around sort of Gravesend, Medway, Strood, Rochester, that kind of area. And then like 4 or 5 generations back, they all moved up to the north of England. And then through circumstances completely out of my control, I had no control over any of it because I was just born down here. I ended up back in that exact area and grew up in that exact area that all of my ancestors before they moved originally came from. Like they were all born around Rochester and Gravesend and everything, and then they moved back up. So it's such an interesting practice, or such an interesting sort of perspective to take, where it's like I had almost no control over any of that, and yet I somehow ended up back in my ancestral homeland without any effort. Nothing to happen. And it's interesting because I also remember having this conversation in one of the witchcraft groups that we were a part of a while ago, where somebody posted a question about what was it? I can't remember who it was who posted it, but they sort of posted this big question around whether people treat sort of Gemma Gary's books on traditional witchcraft as sort of like authoritative canon. And the whole thing, like whether that defines traditional witchcraft, like if the thing that makes you a traditional witch is you follow Gemma Gary's system, and that's the kind of thing. But I remember sort of doing a response to it where I remember saying, like, she actually talks about it in her introduction, I think, which is like the reason that she called her book A Cornish Book of Ways rather than The Cornish Book of Ways is because she's not claiming that it's an authoritative tradition. She's just, pushing out or letting out all of this stuff around her local area. And it's kind of, I've even found myself slightly guilty of it, where it's like I look at it and I look at all of these amazing traditional witchcraft books, whether it's by Gemma Gary stuff, Nigel Pearson stuff, anyone like that, where they're talking about Cornwall witchcraft, Welsh witchcraft, Suffolk or East Anglian witchcraft, stuff like that. And I looked around and it's really great because you learn so much stuff. But then I actually, it was only recently in the past month or so that I took a step back. I was like, I realized that even though I've been practicing traditional witchcraft for like maybe 2 years now, I've never actually picked up a book on Kentish folklore or like the actual like ancestral, like anything to do with Kentish mythology. I was
Interesting,
like,
isn't it?
It's so weird to me. It's like I've been doing all of this stuff and looked at taking all these sources, but I've never actually gone back and looked at any of the stories in my own ancestral homeland. And then when I did, it was so funny because I found a book on Kentish folklore, started reading it, and I don't know what it is. Like maybe you've experienced it, but like hearing, especially if it's in book form or hearing somebody talk about it, but hearing stories and things about places that you grew up in and stories around places that you have a connection to, it just hits differently.
Yes.
Like I don't know what it is, but
it does. I've done a lot of studying around that particular aspect. I'm glad that you brought it up. It's a fascinating thing, and it has to do with the makeup of our brains. It's a very, very fascinating thing. I do want to say, though, and I hesitate to say this, but I do want to admit to something. I was at one point one of those people that would look at Gemma Gary and be like, how dare she think that, all of it's like, without reading her books, right?
Yeah.
Because of how her content, and she's even talked about this as well, the content was taken by a lot of people in North America who then assumed that, okay, this is authoritative. And I think that's a cultural thing. North America, especially the United States, is so Protestant based, and it's such a this is a very strange thing to watch. Growing up as like a lapsed Anglican, five times a year Anglican, right? Seeing that sort of focus on orthodoxy, right? This idea that there has to be a canon,
like 8-way,
And that I think is I think that speaks a lot to where people are coming from. They're coming out of like Baptist traditions, evangelical Christianity, where the emphasis on being correct and believing correctly is so ingrained since you were young that they're not gonna be aware of that necessarily. So they're coming into traditional witchcraft, or they're coming into Wicca, or whatever it is, right? And being like, oh well, this person is the truth, right? Just one of those things about, you know, creating books, right? And I'm sure Gemma Gary, I not speak for her, but I'm sure she feels trapped by that sometimes, right?
Yeah.
It's an issue, but it's something that, again, it says more about where the people, the readership is coming from, as opposed to you as a writer. Maris talks about the same thing. She's received a lot of backlash since she came out with her book, because, and she says it in her intro as well. You know, this is a witch's approach to Welsh witchcraft. This is not the Welsh witchcraft, right? This is, and there are many people in Wales who are very angry at her for even writing a book like this, because, well, how dare you? This is not, you know, our tradition, blah, blah, blah. Well, there's multiple traditions, right? The piece that you picked up on about reading something from your local landscape is a fascinating piece. And this is, I actually taught a class a couple of years ago on folklore. And as I was putting it all together, I came across the work of Dr. Lynn Kelly, who, I don't know if you've ever come across her before.
The name rings a bell, I think.
So she's actually an atheist. She has no belief in spirituality whatsoever, but she became very interested when she visited Stonehenge in political and social geography. And she was looking at Stonehenge. She was like trying to figure out Stonehenge. Her husband was doing some other field work. They're both from Australia. Her work really is in arachnids and physics, and she's a crazy, crazy person, but I love her so much. I've tried to get her on my own podcast, actually, and she of course, politely declined. She said she's way too busy. Okay. What Dr. Lynn Kelly, her basic theory is that when you look at the transition point between hunter-gatherers and kind of settled agriculturalists, you start to see around that period the creation of things like what we would call temples or spaces. We don't know if they're temples. We don't know if what their actual purpose was. But that's kind of how we're conceptualizing it.
Yeah.
She was looking at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which is one of the oldest Neolithic sites, and Stonehenge. And she was looking at it. She was like, trying to figure it out. And then she went to oral cultures that are that exist in the world today, primarily with the Australian Aboriginals. And she was looking at how they maintain their memory systems. So she was looking at, you know, ritual and song and the use of spiritual traditions as a way of maintaining oral history traditions. She looked at the ancient Greek mind palace, the method of Loki, and she was looking at these like Stonehenge and whatnot. She started to theorize that what was actually happening was, there were multiple purposes, of course. She didn't just say that this was the only one, but what was happening was these constructs were actually localized versions of much larger landscapes of the individuals that these ancient people would have been using in oral traditions to maintain their history records. She talked about song lines, which is an incredible aspect of many Aboriginal cultures in Australia. This idea that that you walk a pilgrimage route, you walk a line in the landscape. And when you come to certain features in the landscape, there will be a story associated with the Dreamtime spirits of that landscape. And each of those stories inform you about both the landscape, the history of the people, the history of the ancestors, whatever it happens to be. When you ritualize it, it becomes ingrained. It becomes an ingrained paradigm in your head, so that when you start to walk, when you're in that context of that physical space, suddenly the memories come up. I've worked a lot with memory systems for myself because I had used to have a really terrible memory, and I found that that's really helpful in my work. So she was saying, or her idea is that when you look at like Stonehenge, what you're actually seeing are localized kind of proxies for other features in the landscape that the people who are now suddenly in this one location and not going to move from that location are not going to go and travel to.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
when you look at folklore and how folklore incorporates elements, and this is the thing, there's no such thing as pure folklore.
No.
There is no such thing as pure folklore. Folklore is continually bringing in new elements depending upon whoever is traveling through. The way that stories travel, like you look at Aaron Thompson Smith folklore studies, you can see how a story in India has the exact same core as a story in northern Scotland, but separated by like 1,000 years, because it took that long for that story to travel over through the trade routes, right?
Mm.
When you look at folklore, what's happening is you're actually locating yourself in a landscape. You can look at like a hill and be like, oh, well, that's where the devil was, called by Michael Scottus, and there's a story connected with that. It becomes memorable. It isn't like you're just watching a TV show or reading a book. You actually are placing yourself inside the story, and your memory is connecting and associating with that space. So as soon as you listen, like with Kent, if you're learning about a certain dragon in a certain place, it becomes suddenly very, very vivid and memorable to you and real to you.
Yeah. I suppose in a way, like you mentioned songwriters and Aboriginal cultures there. I guess in a way it's kind of like I guess that it's similar to the kind of idea of what they call the dream time, right? It's you're extrapolating a macro version of events, or like whether you want to see it like an energetic web or whatever it is, like down onto an actual landscape that you're engaging with. And again, I think that's a really interesting point actually you brought up, because taking that kind of approach, the landscape features and landscape everything, is a proxy or sort of like a microcosmic representation either of your own mind or of the best of the universe, whatever it is. It brings, I think, it brings a new layer of experience or understanding to working with the land. Totally. in and of itself, right? Because like first and foremost, especially if you're looking into things like traditional witchcraft, the land and your relationship with it is really sort of the first cornerstone. Like you're not already like there's no way around it really. Like the first thing that you do as a traditional witch, you get out into nature, and that's like what every single book, every single person, every single thing ever tells you is your first step. It's like, don't, like, maybe you can make an argument that you're doing some rites around the hearth of the house or the home or whatever it is, sure, but the majority of experience, the majority of power, whatever it is, it's going to be built up from that collective memory that exists within the landscape, right? And even then it's the same. It's interesting that that same concept has kind of just bled through into tons of different traditions, because even in like New Age and anything traditions that are influenced by theosophy and then Buddhic or Hindu sources, they have that whole thing of the Akashic records or the Akashic memory, which is basically the same kind of idea. It's a collective memory of human experience that's embodied in a concept that you connect to and you download information from, and it's kind of the same idea in traditional witchcraft, except that the collective memory of nature that exists is in the land itself, because the land acts as a geometry that you connect to and then work with, and that's different energies, different forces are flowing through the land. But yeah, I know what you're saying, because I remember seeing even when I was studying, and I read a lot of different anthropological ethnographic accounts of different tribes and different, mainly sort of Indonesian Pacific Islander tribes like that. But even though they don't have quote unquote modernized record keeping, a lot of them remember or they have memories in the form of stories and plays and things like that are recounting events of like when certain islands were first settled. Like, and some of these thousands of myths and stories go back like 1,000 years, and it's the same thing that's been preserved through the folklore and its traditions, the dance and the song and everything like that. But I find that so fascinating. It's such an incredible thing that something like that can be preserved for so long in a somewhat altered but still powerful tradition people can connect to.
Well, and this is the thing. This I think speaks to kind of what we were talking about before with people taking books and orthodoxy, right? As soon as you write something down, it's dead. There's a very old saying there, right? It becomes static. It becomes stagnant. What Lynn Kelly and many of the indigenous elders that she spoke to and worked with, the point they kept coming back to was that there are checks and balances within these cultures to make sure that those records are preserved. This isn't just folklore, it's technology, right? It is a working system that anybody who is initiated into, first of all, learns how to use properly. There are checks and balances. There are spirits who are connected to these, who are also acting as those checks and balances. They're there to either push you on or to, keep people out who are not going to be helping to preserve this wisdom. And it actually fits more in with our memory and how our brains work than written books. I know we've both gone to university. I'm currently finishing a BA in university right now. And I can read a whole paragraph of something and it doesn't make sense. But if I hear it, if I'm hearing it and there's a story connected, like even just an anecdote, suddenly I'm like, oh, there's an anecdote, I can visualize all this throughout the right? Yeah. So what these memory technologies do, and they're landed in the landscape as well, right? Is allowing people to, through association, bring up this information. And it takes many years to learn this information, but there's a system in place. When you look at a lot of these cultures, they start out with very simple stories. Of course, the issue with that is, and Kelly makes a point of this, is, when white people with, patches on their elbows and all this go into these cultures, they're not initiated. Yeah. They don't get to have the higher levels of information. So what are they given? They're given the stories that children are given, right? Which are the stories of the spirits, the stories of the gods, right? But those are meant to be baseline foundational, that then the higher information is placed upon. So it's a layering of information. If we look at traditional witchcraft or even folklore in the UK, it's the same thing. What do kids get taught when they're younger, or should be taught, in my opinion? It's the very simple stories. And then on top of that, they will learn more and more and more. And so it's a lifelong process. The elders are the ones who are not gatekeeping, but who are discerning who is suitable to be able to continue on these traditions and who are not. And so you get inner and outer court sort of approaches, right?
Yeah, that's, you said something there for a second that got me thinking. Magic as a memory technology.
Yes.
That's a very interesting point. Yeah. So using, even if, again, it comes down to how we define ritual, I guess. And I guess because ritual is the medium of magic. It's the way through which you do things, right? Especially if you consider magic as a technology or science, whatever you want to call it, or maybe an art, probably a better way of looking at it. The ritual is your medium. It's the canvas that you're painting all this stuff on. But at its heart, even if you strip away any of the kind of fancy spiritual lingo to it, a ritual is just any action that's repeated. It's any action that's symbolically repeated. Meaningfully.
That's the most important word there, yes.
Yeah, so that you attach sort of symbolic meaning to, and then repeat again and again. So it's like people, and this is one of the things I've explained before in a couple of classes and stuff that I've done, but people have the impression when you talk about a ritual, they think of like people in hoods, like chanting with like that. And it's like, that's the standard sort of media conception of it. But it's like I always remind them, people have like their morning ritual or their nighttime ritual, where it's just a set of behaviors that they just do again and again. It's symbolic. It has a functional reason to it. Well, actually, no, that doesn't have necessarily a functional reason. That's the thing. It may have symbolic meaning, but ritual doesn't always have functional purpose. But the symbology of it speaks to the subconscious mind, because the subconscious mind speaks, and all the language of it is what do you call it? It's symbology, right? The language of the unconscious mind is symbology. And it's one of those interesting things. And I guess this segues a bit into like a discussion of spirits in general, I suppose. But this is one of the things that I always think is really interesting, because one of the ways that one of my mentors always explained working with spirits, or gods especially, but I guess it applies to spirits in general, is the experiences that you have with spirits, they transcend the rational level or the logical level of your brain. They transcend that and they move into the symbology levels, but it's a non-rational mode of experience, or maybe even a hyper-rational mode of experience. And that's not to say it's irrational and there's nothing going on. It's just that it's non-rational. It's not a rational way of thinking. And people always get confused when you look at things like the Greek magical papyri, right? So if you go back to the PGM or anything like that, a lot of the gods and spirits in there are conflated with each other. right? They're joined together, it's super messy. And if you look at it without sort of background reading, you have the author, whoever's writing it, combining Hecate, Selene, Persephone, everyone all into one single god. But one of the ways the thing that's so interesting and that I always love about it is once you understand and realize that it doesn't, like, the logics of that don't really matter. Like, the energy that you're connecting with is that kind of dark, chthonic, feminine archetype as a whole. That's the story or the archetype and narrative that you're connecting to. And then everything that, or the different ways that kind of manifests itself is on different levels and different aspects of consciousness and things like that. But one of the ways I've always kind of conceptualized spirits in general, or gods, or whatever you want to call them, or anything like that, is like, kind of imagine what you have in like high school science class where you shoot light through a prism, where it's like you shoot one single unified beam of light into a prism and it splits off into 7 different colors. All those 7 different aspects or angles or colors, whatever it is, they're all part of the same single archetype, the same light, ultimately. Like, I'm not necessarily saying spirits are all light and stuff, because that's a very new age approach. But the same kind of conceptual idea, where it's like you have all of these maybe different consciousnesses or different concepts or ideas that you connect to, but ultimately, when you go through that kind of meta narrative of the whole thing, it's all communicating one single truth or one single being or entity. So, I mean, in your experience or in your path of how do you conceptualize spirits usually? So when we talk about ancestors or spirits and stuff like that, what are they, I guess, to you?
And this is the thing, I leave it up to them. Leave it up to them. Like, I think that, you know, we can conceptualize and theorize and talk until we're, you know, red in the face about how to conceptualize this, but that's the rationalized mind trying to understand, right? You know, I have met spirits who are sentient. I've met spirits who are probably very just archetypes. I've met spirits who are somewhere in between. I've seen spirit possession where it was not a part of the person who was being possessed. It was very much something outside of them, whether it was, you know, actually anti blah blah blah, or if it was something else. I think that what that speaks to is what you were saying about that getting out of your rationalized mind. When you get out of this 5 senses that we experience the world through, which is only a tiny little slice of reality, you start to see that, you know, reality has much more to it than that, right? So in one moment, a god might be an amalgamation of all other gods as well, but in another moment, they are there just as they are, right? The level of sentience, you know, I think, you know, we consider ourselves sentient creatures, but, you know, higher up, we might not even be looked at as that, right? Similar with gods and spirits, I think that there is a level of sentience when they're interacting on certain levels, when they're interacting on other levels, and connected. I think that sentience, that definition of sentience, changes and disappears or transforms into something else. So I really do take it as it comes. That's a hard question to answer. Because I also like, I practice I practice Hinduism. I'm really connected with that. Spiritismo, which is spiritualism, has its own way of looking. Lakumi has its own way of looking, and then, you know, Druidry and you know, traditional witchcraft have their own way of looking at things. You know, like, what's the difference between an egregore and a full-fledged sentient being? Well, even the writers on egregore say that sentience comes as well in that, or not, right? Depending, right? So I would say that it depends. With ancestors, it's a little bit more clear cut because they were once living humans, right? But I think that once you get to a certain age in that sphere, even that starts to become like that. I talk a lot in my book about kind of expanding that idea of what ancestor is. What is ancestor? It's something or someone that you're descended from, but that doesn't have to be just blood relatives. So I talk about conceptual ancestors and affinity ancestors. Conceptual ancestors are an interesting one because, again, it all comes back to relationship for me. And so I think relationship defines what or who or how a spirit is going to manifest in front of us, how you're going to relate to it. And that for me, I would say is really how I conceptualize spirits now. I came from a place where I was like, no, spirits are all, it's a hard polytheistic view. They're all individuals. They're all. I think that when you get into timey-wimey space, it's all very different, right?
Yeah, it works. But that's an interesting point about conceptual ancestors. Yeah, because like one of the things I've heard a couple of times, which I've always found very interesting, is, I mean, it's usually more in, because this is kind of what I've seen happen in, well, I guess versus like traditional Wicca versus like newer Wicca. One of the things I found is, ever since sort of Margaret Murray's big sort of witch cult hypothesis got quote unquote disproved in academia, which to a certain extent, like I've had this discussion before, in that for the most part, I think in her element, it was fairly accurate to disprove her, but I do worry that we're kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Like I wonder if there isn't some element of it where there was some practice going on. But for the most part, like since her whole thing got disproved by academics or whatever, a lot of sort of traditional Wiccans, they still hold by the whole thing. They still hold that very firm belief that there was a very firmly established witch cult that was pan-European. It was all over the place, and they try and trace their ancestry, or they trace their tradition lineage back to those witches and that kind of thing. But you look at more modern schools of Wicca, they kind of try to separate themselves from that, and instead they seek they connect with lineage as sort of cultural ancestors more so than direct lineage and things like that. But it is also a thing that you see in some schools of traditional witchcraft, the whole thing, what they call like the red thread or the elven bloodlines and things like that, where they think that the witch is, or the witch is sort of descended from the Queen of Elfame and that kind of thing. They have the shared connection or whatever. But it's something I've seen a couple of times before, where some people will, they'll make the argument that they're connecting to former witches that were tried and things like that, and they're connecting to that kind of sphere of energy of things, whereas others will claim that they're going down more sort of very clear blood lines and things like that they have some kind of connection to it. But I've always, I personally, in my own practice, when I use ancestry work or I do ancestry work, I tend to have more, or I feel more familiar connecting to cultural ancestors more so than I do sort of blood relatives. And I mean, I still do blood relative stuff in some traditions and things like that, but I feel more comfortable connecting to cultural things. That's just kind of the way my practice has merged as itself.
Why is that? I'm kind of curious now, just to maybe turn this into a therapy session a bit. What about that is more of a draw for you?
I think it's built up, like in my perception of things, it's built up on a lot of, I don't want to like bring race too much into it, but it's like a lot of my perception on things like race or ancestry and things tends to follow more of like the ancient conception of race or older conceptions of race, rather than notions of whiteness or blackness or anything like that, like the modern conceptions of racial theory. For me, I tend to take what should we say, like with a pinch of salt, I guess you can say, I take sort of the more Greco-Roman view on culture and race, where it's like it's not so much mattering where you come from or sort of the bloodline relation. It's more you can become part of the culture if you become part of the land and you adopt the cultural norms and you adopt the practices and stuff and you become living with it. Whereas like if you look in like the ancient Greek conception of race or racial theory, because they were colonizing everywhere, there wasn't really an idea of like they really cared too much about what color people's skin was or anything like that, or like they were massively xenophobic, don't get me wrong. The Greeks were massively fearful of foreigners, but it was more like the notion or racial notions in ancient Greece, for example, were much more kind of, you could become Greek by taking on the language, by learning the language or connecting to the sort of the traditional quote unquote things that we assign to Greek culture. You could become part of a Greek culture if you took on those practices or took on those aspects of things. And it sort of draws, it's an interesting line between identity and ethnicity, and how many people identify themselves based on their ethnicity or on their like bloodline relations and things like that. Because the other side of it is, coming from an anthropological perspective, there are so many other ways that you can identify yourself or as a cultural group. Like some places do it through shared color, some people do it through landscape, some people do it through I don't know, tapestry weaving patterns and stuff like that. It's like, even then, if we go, like we were talking about Stonehenge earlier, if we go back to, because like one of the things that I always find really hilarious about this is people, especially if you go into sort of the more like extremist sects of like modern British society, like all the Britain First people and stuff like that, they're very much kind of like championing, and this is the kind of like whole thing that behind Brexit and stuff, where they were championing the whole give Britain back to the British kind of thing, where it's like British identity like is such an amalgamation of different things. Like there is no such core thing as a British identity. Like even I said it, like the majority of my ancestry is British and stuff, but even then, like it goes back, even if you go back to medieval, like more or less the medieval period, the Viking Age, the vast majority of people living in Britain today are European descended, right? Or they're from European sources, mainly Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, that kind of stuff. And it's when people sort of use Stonehenge as a symbol of national British pride, that kind of thing. As an archaeologist, I always kind of like to go to them, and I'm like, okay, the people, like the Neolithic people who built Stonehenge are not the same people you're descended from, like modern Britain's descended from, because the vast majority of the people who built Stonehenge either were wiped out or integrated and merged with sort of linear band ceramic and European cultures as they came in. So the vast majority of people who built Stonehenge are not modern Britons. Like the modern Britons are much more ancestral European than anything else. It's like Yamnaya culture and all the like corded ware cultures and things like that. And that's all been confirmed with genetic testing and things. Like archaeologists have done genetic testing, and it all goes back to sort of Proto-Indo-European and that kind of thing. But it's just, I mean, we're kind of getting off the point. But like for me, I kind of always like to take that view in that, for me, bloodline or sort of section doesn't matter. Or like I would say it doesn't matter. It's just, it's not at the forefront of how I identify myself, really.
That's a perfect point. I was hoping that this would come up too. Another piece I wrote about in my own book around that is not even cherry picking. It's not cherry picking, but it's how people identify themselves, and a lot of identity is culturally created, right? Doesn't mean that it's not important, but it is culturally created. It's a construct, right? And I have noticed this when you tend to look at people, they tend to be very kind of focusing on one aspect of their bloodline, right? You know, my family is from like if I were to identify with only one strand of my bloodline, I am a Londoner. I will always be a Londoner because in 1821 ancestor came from London to Manchester, and that's where I came from, right? Cherry picking as well. Not cherry picking. I don't want to say that because that sounds so dismissive, but it is. I mean, look at
I know what you mean. Yeah.
Right. Because of religious trauma, they cannot stand thinking that they're connected to Christians because those are interlopers and they, you know, they're all of this blah. And so who do they look at? One very particular group of people from 2,000 years ago. Well, if you really consider how just lineage works, 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents, go on and so forth. 2,000 years ago, you'd have like over a quadrillion ancestors. So there's this concept in genealogy and genetics, family tree breakdown. Eventually, you're getting to a point as you move backwards. Like if you only go back, and it doesn't take a long time, you only go back 400 years, and you've got millions of ancestors, perhaps, you know, more people than there were on the planet, right? Eventually, what you'll see is the same person showing up multiple times in your family tree, to the extent that the further back you go, the more of the community is your ancestor, until the entirety of the community you're related to. And so then in that way, if you think about it, it doesn't make any sense to relate to this one little tiny band of pagan ancestors 2,000 years ago because of your own issues with all those Christians in between, right? So that's where I think like affinity ancestor can come in, because it's not a cop-out, but it allows you to then express your own individual identity and relate to those ancestors who are going to be supportive of that. Because the other thing too, I think a lot of people get around this, like you were saying, the British First people, right? Or Britain First people, is they live for their ancestors, they don't live for themselves, or they project onto those ancestors and try to use them as an excuse, you know. And you're absolutely right. Conceptions of identity throughout time have changed and shifted so that, like the ancient Romans as well. I know that they had major conflict around this. Should Gauls be considered Romans? Well, they're wearing togas and growing wine and living in villas. What is more quintessentially Roman? It becomes complicated. And this is all, again, comes back to that main point for me about relationship. How are you relating to these beings, these spirits, whatever? If you, looking at the what you were saying about the traditions that really connect with mythological ancestors in a bloodline relative. Well, I would question, first of all, what is the intent with that? What are they getting out of that? What is that relationship? Because in folklore, you look in Orkney, you look on the west coast of Ireland, there are communities that descend from, or are said to descend from Selkies and mermaids and merrows. You look at like Plantagenets, right? Descending from Melusine. If we look at it from that, the late Queen Elizabeth II is descended from Woden, Odin, Melusine, Noah, all of these creatures, right? Not in a literal sense, but in a way a literal sense, because power also comes from that sort of association too. So there's a lot to it. Buy the book next year. It's all in there.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. It sounds amazing, actually. It really does. But yeah, it's interesting actually, because I think even with Queen Elizabeth, it's always kind of funny, because there are also so many conspiracy theories around the royal family as a whole. Like some people, because I think I think Elizabeth traces her ancestry back. I think it's to Alfred, like Alfred the Great, and it's like the Wessex dynasties for this part. But even then, I can't remember who it was. Like it's either her or it's like Princess Anne or something like that, who traces their lineage back to Ceolwulf, one of the first Anglo-Saxon kings, who then traces his lineage back to Odin, or who was like the grandson of Odin, stuff like that. So it's like, okay, well, sure, the royal family is descended from Odin, whatever. But then it's like, okay, yeah. But then you look into like Philip and like the masculine side of the family, and his whole thing is descended from like I think it's like the Wallachian monarchy in Romania with like Vlad the Drac and all that kind of stuff, and it's mainly like Greek and Romanian, all that kind of ancestry. Which then it also just goes back to, well, most of it goes all the way, especially if you go down the whole German family tree and stuff, most of it goes back to the Holy Roman Empire and Charlemagne and all that kind of stuff. And there's a bunch of folklore around Charlemagne anyway, because like even then it goes on to our discussion about bloodlines, where Charlemagne kind of gets the same treatment as like Genghis Khan, I think, where people kind of say that every, like, was it some like weird one, like every male person in Europe is like related to Charlemagne distantly, and even then, like Genghis Khan is supposed to have fathered like 6 million descendants, like that. So it's like, okay, like most of the known world is somehow related to Genghis Khan. So then, like, again, when you look at it, when you look into things like that, especially if any of that stuff genetically holds weight, does that mean that we can start, interacting with Mongolic religion and that kind of thing, or start Mongolic ancestry because we're somehow related to Genghis Khan or Charlemagne or anything?
That's the key piece here. There is, and you'll know with your background, genetics does not equal culture, right?
Yeah.
So with Celtic, many peoples in Northern Europe were speaking Celtic languages. Doesn't necessarily mean that they were related to each other, because culture is often translated through trade, warfare, and all these other things. So for people who say, like you going back to what you were saying about DNA before, North Americans who are taking, and they are like 17% Russian and 50% Scottish and all this and all the other, and they start to explore Russian spirituality. I think it again comes back to that relationship, but again, culture doesn't necessarily connect with genetics. We don't know what the situation was.
Well, that's the thing. It's one of those things that I always bring up to people when they ask me about it, because especially Celtic stuff. It's that's Celtic stuff is one of the what do we call it? What's the nice way of putting it? It's one of the higher offenders, I think. Like a lot of people really appropriate Celtic spirituality massively, and I think one of the reasons for it is there does seem to be this perception that Celticity or Celticity is a kind of like a pan identity for things, whereas like in actuality, Celtic is a language. Actually, like Celtic is a language found in different languages, and sure, maybe there's an argument, like there is an argument that those languages derive from a similar mother sort of source or sort of mother language. They derive from Proto-Celtic, which derives from Indo-European and all that kind of stuff. So that linguistically they are related. And sure, there may be some overlapping mythologies or motifs and stuff like that. You know, you see the Gunstart Cauldron, Sir Nunos on the Pillar of the Boatman and things like that, all those kind of figures. But to say that, you know, British Celtic, even then, if we're looking into straight, even if we just look at Britain and ignore Europe for a second, yes, Celtic is sort of, there are different Celtic languages in Britain, but there are huge cultural differences between Cornish, Welsh,
Absolutely.
Manx, Irish, Scottish, all of it. There are so many different variations in all of those different cultures. Like, sure, there are some elements that are universally shared, like the bigger elements of things, absolutely. But on a day-to-day actual personal level, the cultures are entirely different. They have different means of expression, they have different stories, all this kind of thing. And that's just Britain. And then like you take it over to Europe, and it's like you have so many different things, mostly that are emerging out of like Hulstar and the Latin and all that kind of stuff. But it's just like, and when people come along and they're like, oh, well, I have Celtic ancestry. It's like, okay, I'm a bit questioning like what that means. But
yeah, what does that mean? Well, and that's the thing too. I think that speaks to that idea of, you know, narrowing down to one particular part, because yes, those people have Celtic ancestry, but they also have Roman ancestry, they also have Germanic ancestry, they also probably have, you know, North African ancestry, because in the span of 2000 years, you don't know who has come into your bloodline. And that's why I think looking at ancestors just as blood is deceptive, because you have a big swath of different people. And then how do you then connect with culture? That's why with a lot of ancestor work, it tends to be those generations that are closest to you, as opposed to working with an ancestor from like 1500 years ago. And eventually you'll get, like I said, eventually you'll get to a point where your family story is the family story of the whole community. And so there are far too many people, far too many peoples to connect with there. Where do you find yourself? It will become so confusing. English people are a good example of this, right? When you look at the Anglo-Saxons coming over, whether it was an invasion or whether it was just a migration, whatever, I'm not going to comment on that. The genetic research is coming out, and it's proving that a large number of the Britons, the native Britons, were not displaced or killed. They were just integrated, often through in the same way that any other culture will have integrations. I don't know if you have comments on that, but most of the time people would just, you know, they would continue to be using the land. There was no sense that the land suddenly was stopped being tilled, stopped being used as this so-called invasion was happening. And so, like the Picts up in Scotland, they just went through a name change. They just started dressing and assimilating to Anglo-Saxon culture. So then genetically, most English people have Celtic or British, Britain genetics to them, right? Because of the commingling. So then you have a situation where both ancestors, or both ancestral spheres, one Anglo-Saxon, one British, right? Which one do you choose? How do you identify? Which one do you identify with? Because if you only see your lineage as being singularly, I am this, right? Then how you're going to ignore vast swaths of your identity. You look like you want to say something, Rose, so I'll let you jump in.
No, I'm taking it in. No, it's interesting. No, but yeah, it's this whole thing, because it reminds me there are different, and it's funny how much all of these kind of discussions, all of these are sort of identities and ways of identifying mirror different sort of paradigms that we've moved through in archaeology in general, and how we understand culture as a whole, right? Because back in sort of like the 40s and 50s, where you have people like Gordon Childe and sort of the major, like main big famous archaeologists, Mortimer Wheeler, Gordon Childe, anyone like that, who were sort of your, you know, handlebar mustache, like guys with like suede patches and stuff. They kind of took a very, well, I guess what we call like culture historic viewpoint of archaeology and culture in general, where it's like they would look at a map and it's like if somebody has this kind of pottery or this kind of, you know, artwork or this kind of textile, this kind of whatever, they belong to this culture, and this culture has exactly this kind of grouping. And then another one, if there's like there's a little bit of this pottery like over here, then nobody else could have done it. Somebody from that culture has to have gone over there to do it, and all this kind of thing. And then it moved over into like what we call like processual or more kind of scientific objective archaeology, where it's like, okay, well, actually culture isn't this static thing where actually different things can, you know, move around. Just because there's a different bit of pottery from this group of identity over here doesn't mean that these people made it. It could be a local interpretation, it could be something else, it could be somebody else exerting their own thing. And then now we're kind of in this like more modernized kind of post-truth reality of things, where it's like post-processualism is more, it's highly interpretive, where it's like it entirely depends on the interpretation of the person viewing the evidence, because then how they attribute their own biases or their own
very much so
their own things into the actual record on how we define what it means to be a culture, exactly what that actually means, right? Because even then, if you keep tracing the lineage back and back and back and back and back, or for the most part, a lot of the Celtic languages, or a lot of whether it's Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, all things, most of Europe all goes back to Indo-European, right? It goes back to all Proto-Indo-European, where there are linguistic relations between different things, and in which case then we can unify most of Europe, India for sure, Iran probably, and then like and then like Greek, Latin, all those kind of things, they all descend from Indo-European as a whole, and it's both linguistically, but then also to a certain extent culturally or motif-wise, because you know they're sharing key elements in their mythologies and things like that, which are then passed on through folklore. So then it goes back to what we were saying back at the beginning of that, where it's like even then even though these mythologies and things are having their different expressions with different spirits and different stories, they're all ultimately articulating the same core memory of like a culture that existed. And it's that even then it's like, is it really fair to call Proto-Indo-European or Indo-European a culture? Because even then it's a language, but it's such a difficult, weird conversation to have, because there are we just don't know enough about them as a group of individuals, right? We don't know.
And the other piece to that too is, you know, the way that culture kind of perpetuates itself is very viral in many ways, right? It will incorporate and mutate depending on where they are. So Proto-Indo-European culture might have been taken and it was taken and perpetuated, but there were other people strewn throughout those areas too. It wasn't just like a band that were having babies and then multiplying and filling up the landscape. There were other peoples there. So, you know, the differences between Indian, like ancient Vedic, pre-Vedic, and Celtic, or pre-Celtic, whatever, the differences there can be mutated because of the presence of other people there. And that's the key piece. Eventually divergence will happen in the same way that language divergence happens, mutates, evolves, and so on and so on. It becomes landed in the landscape. So the equation can't be fully, you know, put there. But again, it comes back to that idea of identity, right? It comes back to that idea of intent and what's at stake for people. And I think if we were to bring this to witchcraft, like I see it all the time on all these witchcraft groups, like, am I allowed to do this? Am I allowed to do that? In traditional witchcraft, do I do this? And that I think that speaks to that idea of you know, the perpetuation of culture, when in reality, like witchcraft is a lot more fluid than that, right? But I think that what you were saying, that assumption of what happened, the assumption of relationship, the assumption of history, is one of those big issues. So like you see a lot of people like the ADF, for example, which is a North American Druid organization. Their approach to reconstructing kind of ancient Indo-European religion is to take all of the constituent parts in existing now and do a cross-analysis. Okay, well, fire is in all of these different traditions: Slavic, Celtic, Indian, ancient Greek and Rome, right? And so fire must have been a core component. I think that's an interesting way of going about it, but I can see that there's plot holes in that too, right? Because, you know, causality doesn't, correlation doesn't, what's the phrase? You know what I'm talking about. It's very early over here. That's why my coffee cup is so big. You know what I'm saying? You know, And so, but again, it comes back to the idea of what are you narrowing in on? What aspect is important to you now? And what are your intentions now? Same with archaeology. People always are looking at history through the lenses of their current. You know, there's no such thing as an objective view of history.
Yeah.
And there's no objective researchers. As objective as people try to be, there will always be that paradigm that you exist within. I'm sure in 20 years' time, the paradigm that is happening in universities now are going to be looked down upon, and there'll be all sorts of criticisms and more books published and a lot of money spent on all that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry,
Yeah,
it's there. Sorry.
no, it's right. It's true though. I think it's one of those things. I mean, it's used to be. I mean, we see it a bit in archaeology and history cycles, but it's more prevalent in things like if you go into medicine and stuff like that, where it's like you only get funding for stuff that confirms already established stuff.
Yes.
You know, whereas like because as long as it's conferring whatever the current narrative is, then you'll get funding for it, right? And then it's one of those awkward, annoying catch-22 moments where you can't make any progression without funding, but they only give you funding if you confirm an already established narrative to things, which itself has its own interesting, I guess, dynamics to the whole thing, where it's like if we relate it back to seeing things as like a memory landscape, or we approach it as a landscape, what you're doing by repeating that kind of symbolic action again and again, you're just reinforcing that collective memory, and it's becoming denser and denser, which then it's locking us in, so we can't actually break out of it. But I think one of the ways that always sort of helped me when I was looking at this kind of stuff is to see even science as a whole, because science has kind of become like a big buzzword for things, and people like think it's an objective, like clear thing, or it's like a holy scapegoat for things. Like, well, the science doesn't say this. It's like, well, science is a method, it's not a core thing, right? But science as a whole, it goes through paradigm shifts. The same way the cult does. It mutates, it does everything, and whenever a new paradigm comes in, it comes in because it addresses all the outliers of the previous paradigm. That's the reason it comes through. It's what happened to, if you look at something like quantum mechanics as opposed to general relativity, right? The whole reason that quantum mechanics got started and really got popular was because it was addressing things that didn't make sense in the context of relativity. And it's the same kind of thing if you extrapolate it generally into mainstream science, right? Science will go through waves of differences and different understandings and different paradigms. But it's its own, I don't know, yeah, it's a very interesting discussion, I think, around how we relate to the material around us as a whole. It's like, because some people, especially with science, they'll only trust like cited academic sources, and there is some truth in that, right? I like the element to it where I would agree with that is that, like, with academic sources, like there's such a high standard of proof required to go through it that you can probably trust it. But people kind of teeter on that spectrum where it's like they'll only trust it and they'll ignore like folkloric sources or anything like that, where it's like there is still some element of truth that's preserved in the folklore. And there's still some element of truth that's still preserved in places.
Completely. But I think what you're saying there really speaks to the idea of authenticity, right? What is considered authentic? And people bring their own ideas of what is considered authentic. Going back to what we were saying about Gemma Gary, right? Gemma can say as much as she wants. This is a version. This is my experience. All this is not all the other. People will ignore that if that is what they are looking for. This is what I need. This is what the experience I want. And I think in many ways that's the power of ritual. Ritual. I'll slightly disagree with you. I think what you were saying can be applied in some ways, but I'll slightly disagree with you that people get locked into ritual. I think ritual, when done right, and this is what going back to what we were saying before you started recording about mysteries, the mystery traditions. The mystery traditions were giving an experience. It was an initiatory experience. It was up to all of the individuals who were taking part in that experience to take away for them and apply that experience to their life. And that was the transformative element, right? You can think about and rationalize and just, to death what you just experienced, but going through the actual experience is more powerful. And that's why it was so that's why they would kill people if they weren't initiated and they were trying to spy in, because the sanctity of that experience is what was important. That was the transformative element. And so when people experience folklore in a landscape, when people experience story is a huge part of my spirituality too. When people experience story as an insider, it doesn't matter what the rationalization is, or if it's authentic, or if it's what it's connected to, or right? It's about being in the moment, being in the middle of the story, and then it's up to you to take away and then rationalize it however way you want. But the ritual itself is not giving you a theology to follow. It is not saying this is what. It's a space that you're entering into. It's not just it's not a theology. It's not a book, right?
Yeah, I think it's also no coincidence in that, when we take that kind of viewpoint on things, I think it's no coincidence that the hearth is often the center of traditional witchcraft. The hearth is the place ultimately where you share stories. Right, it's the place, that's the place where folklore and stories are passed on. It's the place you go to and you sit around with your grandparents or whatever on like a cold winter's night. The flames going, you've got some, I don't know, some ale, some mead, whatever, in medieval, early modern period, whatever it is. And that's the place where knowledge is passed on. Right, it's passed on in the form of stories a lot of the time. And I think that is one of the reasons, at least in my experience of it, that's one of the reasons why the hearth has retained its importance, why there are so many rites and rituals that are done around the hearth in traditional craft, because you're tapping into that, that essence of whatever's going on. You're tapping into that grand story or the grand narrative of things that then helps you connect. And I agree, actually. It's not like ritual, it's a way of you engaging the story. It doesn't give you the theology, it doesn't necessarily give you the story. It's the door or the way you engage it. And then also like how you download from it, how you get information from it. But it doesn't necessarily create the narrative as a whole. It's just your way of reading it, I think. And it's I don't know, it's one of those things, it goes back, it's something interesting you mentioned there about the experience of, again, in mystery traditions and things, the experience is so utterly transformative as a whole. And that transformation comes from engaging the story. Right, it comes from like a part, or like a major part of it, especially if you look into like actual, I guess we could say, authentic mystery traditions, like stuff like the Eleusinian mysteries, for example, which are the most famous, obviously. Like a huge key part of that ritual was the reenactment of the whole Persephone Demeter reunification. Right, so the whole sort of part of the whole central ritual was basically a drama. It's like you were viewing and engaging a drama, and through engaging that story, it's like a play, right? You're watching a play, you're watching even a sacred dance, even in a way. And even then, it's the same thing, because in what is it? A lot, one of the main wordings, or one of the best phrases that's often applied to mystery traditions or initiates, is that people will dance out the mysteries. And it comes up in like mainly like Dionysian mysteries a lot, but the idea of dancing, and for like ecstatic dance and stuff to engage it, but you are engaging a narrative. Ultimately, like narrative and story are at the heart of mystery traditions, that ultimately they are what provide the transformative experience ultimately.
And that's what magic is, right? When you're performing ritual, when you're performing a spell, when you're doing anything, when you're actually doing it, you're entering into a mini story. You're perpetuating that story and transforming the world through that story, right? But it's the engagement that's the most important piece, like you said. There's something you said that I want to pick up on too. It's that idea of what was it you said? Engagement. That's really what it is. But going back to what you said something a little while ago about how people can again get trapped into kind of ritual and whatnot, and it becomes stagnant. When you write things down, that's when it becomes stagnant. When you look at ritual, when you look at kind of how storytelling works and how and when you get into it, right? It changes with the people who are engaged with it. The ritual becomes culturally relevant in the now, as well as looking back to when other people were performing it. That's why ancestral ritual is so powerful, is because there is enough of an element there that relates to those ancestors that create that link, but also making it relevant now. People are engaging in the ritual, the activity. Look at Dia de los Muertos in Mexico, Day of the Dead, right? People are experiencing it, and they're experiencing with their children and their ancestors. It becomes a sacred space, a space outside of the temporal, and it changes to suit the culture. We look at folklore traditions in the UK, for example, right? The hobby horse traditions. They're fun, they're vibrant. We've lost a lot of traditions because they weren't relevant anymore. And so that's where folklore, I think, and story in general, it has a fluidity to it that will make it flow into the current times in the needed way. And that's what also makes it very powerful and dynamic as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It always reminds me. I can't remember who said this. It was one of the. It's one of the authors on traditional witchcraft. I can't remember which one. But they a lot of. I think a lot of them probably talk about it. But this whole idea of traditional witchcraft or witchcraft as a whole doesn't have a founder. You know, if you look to major religions and stuff like that, like you can trace it back to a prophet or a single sort of event that happens that triggers the religion, and then people start following it. But by its nature, traditional craft, because it's drawing from folklore so much, it doesn't have a single founder. It's not a consistent system. It's just people adding to whatever it is with their own things that are happening. So, and one of the things I think is so amazing about it, and what attracted me to it in the first place, was something that could have happened last week could have just as much relevance to your tradition as something that happened 1,000 years ago, right? Because it's how people are engaging with the information that they have and how they're dancing out that kind of experience that they have. But it's such a fascinating thing when you engage ritual as a story, I think, and it's like you're weaving that kind of narrative that exists, and it's like you have that kind of collective narrative between different practitioners. And it's like, I remember having this discussion where it's like at some point where me and another practitioner had almost the same exact experiences, doing the same kind of rituals, doing the same kind of thing. We had these same experiences that ended up happening. But we were talking about it, and we'd never met before. Like, we had never interacted, we'd never met, we'd never spoken, anything. We were both articulating the exact same experiences. And it's just like one of the ways that we were talking about it is like it's not that we both made up these experiences. It's that there is something here that we are engaging with that is providing these experiences that happens. And again, it is such a dynamic and fluid thing. I think that how each individual person interacts with, even if it's a god or an entity or anything like that, how each individual does that and how it manifests for themselves is such an individual personal thing, which is difficult in a way when you're trying to talk about it in like a mass scale. You're like, okay, here's how you do stuff, right? Here's everything you need to do, as opposed to doing it in terms of like more one-on-one speaking or one-on-one training and things like that. But I mean, it's such a fascinating topic, and it's why I love working with witchcraft or magic in general, right? It's what magic, all magic is, when you're engaging these narratives, we're creating these narratives.
Absolutely.
And in a way, I think it's like part of me that gets sad in a weird way. It's like a lot of the more modern sort of popularist spiritual traditions miss that. Like that kind of understanding of or engagement with the world is kind of stripped from a lot of modern spiritual practice, like in the New Age community, or any of the kind of quantum derived spiritualities and stuff like that. It's kind of that connection with the land or with your own stories as a human, right? It's kind of divorced itself from that. And I remember you said something earlier. It's like, I think a large part of the reason why is it's kind of like a rejection to Abrahamic faiths, right? Or like Christian faiths, stuff like that. People are so averse, and it's kind of the same. We see it in the pagan community as well. Like, some people are so sort of, they have such religious trauma around it that they kind of divorce themselves entirely from Christianity because of everything that they perceive has happened. But it's one of those interesting things of like, even when you go back to stuff like Gnosticism, a Gnostic in sort of the early centuries AD would still have more in common with a Christian than they would with a pagan, right? Because they're both still worshiping Jesus, or they both still acknowledge Jesus. They're both still acknowledging different aspects of the Bible and different gospel texts. But people don't really acknowledge that. They think they see Gnosticism as like a rejection of mainstream Christianity. Yeah. But it's like, it still exists inside of this current, like it still exists inside of this memory aspect of things, right? So I do wonder, because I suppose it's also a question of like, again, what you're hoping to achieve when getting into witchcraft. Like some people do it, or they come at witchcraft from that perspective of they've rejected the church, right? So they're coming into it to find that sense of faith, but they're coming into it from a place of rejection.
Yes.
And then it's like, what kind of energy is that bringing to the table when you're working with spirits or working with your ancestors? If you're coming at them from a position of rejection.
Absolutely.
I think one of the things, or the thing that always struck me, is that when I first started practicing witchcraft, or first started connecting with spirits, it felt a lot more like I was coming home than I was rejecting anything external. It felt like I was just like coming. It was like I was like going back to my own fireplace or my own hearth, like that feeling you have when you walk through the front door. Yes. Like this just feels completely natural to me. Like it doesn't make sense why people want to reject any of this. But again, yeah, it depends on how or what biases and what beliefs and stuff you're bringing to the table and why you're coming into it, right?
Absolutely, and I think that for everybody there's a journey when it comes to not even changing religions, but as you grow and you move into and explore new things, there's always a journey of understanding yourself and also unpacking a lot of things, particularly with witchcraft. Though I think a draw for a lot of people is to find a place of power, right? Whether that's for healthy or unhealthy reasons. I'm gay. When I was coming out at 15, I was in the town of 18 churches and none of them wanted to know me, right? I was also a British kid in Canada and I was different, right? So for me, what you said about coming home, that was a real draw for me, like I started exploring witchcraft because it reminded me of home. Like a lot of the works back then looked to the UK and looked to Britain as kind of the source of witchcraft. That's really diversified now. But I think to your point about what are people bringing to the table, that's exactly it. But there's also a process of evolution in that too. There's a process of growth. There's a meme that was going around. And it's, the first is, when you're new to witchcraft and you've got all the books and the candles and this, that, and all the other. And then a little bit later, when you're a little bit seasoned into witchcraft and you're just banging a bowl saying, fuck off, when you're cleansing. And I think that says a lot to that idea of coming out of a cultural tradition that is, you have to believe this, you have to do this, it's correct practice, right? As opposed to taking ownership and exploring it for you. And in truth, I have to be honest, that caused a lot of issues for me when I started to explore different forms of witchcraft. Because, when I came out, it was, or when I came into the community 20 years ago now, a lot of it was online. A lot of it was very, this path, this path, this path, this path. And then it was suddenly everybody's path, right? When I started kind of exploring hoodoo and traditional witchcraft and this and all the other, even on the big group that we're on together, I see people using very specific language and talking to each other through very specific language, like using a stang, using a besom, using all of this, right? And when, some of that language is derived from a particular author or one particular book, and they assume that is then generalized language and they're interacting. And I feel like there can often be a lot of hierarchy around that. I felt left out because, I don't have less necessarily the lingo, all the specialized language about, that you see people using now. But when you actually ask them to explain what that is, it's like a puppet. There's so many different specialized words for puppets now, homunculus, this and that, or the other, right? And it's like, yes, I understand what you're saying now because yes, I do practice that. I just don't use that language because to me, I don't need to use that language. because it's such a personal practice, right? So I feel like, again, people miss the point when it comes to a lot of this. Maybe I shouldn't be saying this as a forthcoming author, but people miss the point because they want to use the right terminology, they want to use the right correct language without really knowing that what that language actually is. I'm not talking about those seasoned practitioners where they're just going to use that language just to get to the point. I'm talking about people who are new to the tradition and they're taking it up as, you know, as tradition, as opposed to, you know, a family of different things that are somewhat interconnected sometimes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those, it's a similar argument when we're using terminology. It's one of those similar arguments that I've always had about my issues with academia in a weird way as well. Because one of the things one of the core issues that you always see in general is not a lot of people know where to or how to access academic sources. And even in the cases where they do, a lot of the papers and stuff are written in such a way where they use such specific language and jargon that it alienates people from the actual whole culture. And there is this kind of elitism that exists in academia, and it is a real shame, because what ends up happening is the people a lot of the time who need the information most are the ones who are excluded from it the most, which is that's the ultimate, that's the biggest tragedy with the whole thing. And that was actually one of the original founding things of why I started my platform stuff in general. It's like making that bridge available, where it's like not only are we providing the material, but we're teaching you how to read it, right? Like giving you a library and the information that exists, but then we're also saying, hey, here's all the background stuff you need to know in order to be able to actually understand it. Like here is I don't know, like a lot of one of the phrases that I've always sort of become accustomed to saying, and I actually learned this from Kerry Wisner, who was also on the podcast, where rather than saying this is witchcraft, this is what you do, I'm like, this is what I do in the tradition that I was raised. Like this is what I've learned. This is how I do it in the form of witchcraft that I know. This is how we do it. It's like, and that kind of way, when you approach it like that, it's much more of a fluid dynamic, because you're not locking yourself in to say, this is witchcraft, this is what it does, this is everything, right? And you can kind of interact with people however it comes, or wherever they're coming from. So I always make a point of saying, this is how I've done it, or this is how the tradition in which I was raised does stuff. And then that tradition, for me, it goes back to mainly the PGM or even Greco-Egyptian sources, because that's kind of, I went way more down the high magic route before, like when I was getting started, more so than traditional witchcraft. And it's only recently in the past like 2 years that I've got or done more inroads into traditional craft. And it's such an interesting, I don't know, difference of practices, even though they're both magic, like both high magic and traditional witchcraft, even though they're both forms of magic, they are very different in a way. Like there are some overlapping principles, and there is some exchange going on, stuff like that between the two, especially in cunning folk traditions. They'll like take from the ceremonial tradition all the time. But it's like the high magic is a very kind of structured, you're learning from a grimoire or a textbook. It's very much, you need to look at the right hours, the right incenses. It's very kind of, very logical system. It's very kind of masculine energy system, whereas traditional witchcraft is much more of a fluid, intuitive based system. And then it's not to say traditional witchcraft doesn't have a logic to it, because it absolutely does.
Completely, it has completely.
Yeah, but it's just that it like, you're not going to get as far, I think, in traditional craft if you're approaching it with like a very strict paradigm in your mind, where it's like there's like a strict methodology to how you do things. It's like, I don't think I've known a couple of I know a couple of witches now in my personal life, which I'm happy about, because I've mostly been a solitary practitioner. Like one of my equinox ritual, it was on the last equinox, it's just gone, one of the last rituals I did was like, I'm going to manifest creating not necessarily like a coven, but I just want to meet more people in real life who do stuff so I can talk to them. And it started happening. Thankfully, the ritual was a success, and I started meeting some new people in real life who are doing witchcraft. It's such an interesting thing to me, because like even something as simple as creating a compass or casting a circle, right? I don't think I've ever met two practitioners who open a circle the same way.
No.
And yet it's such a pervading commonality between all schools of witchcraft, and yet every single person I've met does it differently. And it's like that in itself raises an interesting point, in that there's sort of the narrative, or the grand narrative of how we're looking at things, and then there's how that's interpreted by the individual, and the interaction between that too, because it's like there's this practice that exists, the creation of the circle, that is in almost every single aspect of things, whether it's European witchcraft or like British witchcraft and all the different cultures, but every culture does it differently. So there's still room, even in the parts where there are commonalities, there's still room for personal expression for things, which is like another thing that's really interesting to me.
Well, and that's the thing, right? That comes back to that personal ownership piece, right? When you do something by rote, you will be so connected to the symbol without necessarily understanding what it is. When you understand what the symbol actually represents, so casting a circle is actually about creating sacred space, right?
Yeah.
If you're in a temple that's already dedicated sacred space, what is the purpose of doing that circle, right? When you're outside, creating that sacred circle is important. How you go about that is going to depend on how you practice, right? And so that I think really speaks to that piece. And the more you get to know people, and this is, I think, the other problem too, traditional witchcraft, my perception of traditional witchcraft is, and tell me if I'm wrong with this, but my perception has been, well, just watching online, is that a lot of people are now attracted to traditional witchcraft in North America because when they tried to go into hoodoo, they were told, well, you're white, you can't be connected to this, or don't appropriate our traditions. And because they were appropriating traditions, so they're looking, oh, cunning craft, oh, okay, well, this is really connected to my ancestry, I'll go with that. They're coming to it, and again, what we were talking about is by rote, right? But there's also that solitary idea as well. Like, I know tons of gay witches all over the place. For some reason, gay male witches particularly love cunning craft. I don't know what that is, but I love it. But they're solitary. And so when you're not actually interacting, when you're in a vacuum of just interacting with people online, not necessarily living or being with people, you're not necessarily going to see the little details like, how are they casting circles? They just talk about online, and I cast a circle. And then in your mind, well, okay, well, that's what that is. That must be what they're doing. So I think there's a lot to be said about actually connecting with people, but it's difficult, and it's become such a big thing now. Like, what do people mean by traditional witchcraft? What is this? You know what I mean? So it's an interesting thing.
Yeah, I think there is definitely I don't know what you call it. There is definitely a difference of feeling doing stuff online versus in person. Like, there's no two ways about that. I think there is definitely something. I don't want to say it's missing, because there is, like, and again, this kind of comes down a little bit goes back to our discussion of memory, and it kind of conceptualizes how we talk about spirits and stuff in general, because I've heard some interesting debates, especially in like the egregore space and that kind of energy, where it's like there are egregores of the internet now, and there are spirits that are all quote unquote spirits, if you want to define them as that exist within the online sphere, like within the actual, whether it's inside the code or anything like that, of the actual internet and stuff. I don't know. I'm not going to comment on where they exist, but it's this whole thing. Yeah, but it's like, and it kind of creates egregores. Like, even the witchcraft group that we're a part of as a whole, it has its own egregore. So in a way, it probably, like, all the collective experience of the people in there that are sharing all their experiences, it's created a sort of a supra consciousness of the group in general. And it's like, even every business, every online space, anything that has enough people interacting with it creates an egregore as a whole, right? It creates a spirit, whatever you can interact with, and that has its own identity and stuff like that. So there is some element to it where I do think, even if you're online, especially if you know about egregores and you know how to connect with them and download that kind of information and engage in that kind of practice, then there can be some kind of shared collective experience with things. You can interact with it through ritual, that kind of thing. But it doesn't compare, in my opinion, it doesn't compare to in person. Like, when you're in person with another actual living person around you who is doing ritual, and you're doing ritual in person, there is a kind of, I don't know what you call it, there is a kind of energy that's created between people who practice witchcraft together, as a community or as partners or things like that. And I don't know, like it's one of the big reasons why on my radar is like one of the big key goals is to start finding places for retreats and like bringing people together in person to start doing stuff, because like you can read every single book, you can even like do every bit of practice individually in your room or in your back garden or whatever it is, and it's great, or you can join every single group, but there's a different kind of energy that's created when people come together in person and interact in person. And I wondered, like, to a certain extent, if it's the same or at least a similar kind of energy that's created around cultures, or what gives rise to cultures. In general, it's that collective communal energy that comes in and then builds up again and again. And by engaging that, you have that kind of community energy that exists. I think it's yeah.
Well,
it's
even when you're practicing individually, you're still working with a community of spirits. It's the people,
right.
I think, who, they're reading the books, but they're not practicing. They're not doing anything.
The armchair occultists.
Exactly, right. And I mean, I love them. Like I love, the tweed jackets and all of that. But it's one of those when you're actually interacting. I think it speaks a great deal to use a naughty word, animism. I think it speaks to that animism, right? I know that is there's a lot to unpack.
I don't know where it's. I mean, I know. I've heard arguments for and against it either way. So
Right. Because it's an anthropological term that it's been applied to so many different cultures, and all of those different cultures have slightly different or major variations. But I for my practice, the more I interact with my life, the more I age. I'm 36. I'm getting up there. I don't look it, but I'm getting up there. The more the more I understand just myself in relationship to other people, the more I see, the world around us is so timey-wimey. Like I can't even describe. It's fluid, right? And so when with that piece, what you were talking about, when you're with somebody else practicing, there is a space, there is a spirit of that space, even if it just exists for that moment, right? Online, I think that will emerge more as people go into VR, as we start to experience virtual reality in a slightly different way. But it's not quite there. I have to be honest, I'm kind of caught between that too. It's like the whole American Gods thing, like how much of that is real versus how much of that, like what is the difference between sentient beings and spirits versus egregores? I haven't come out to any. That'll be exploration for many years.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because again, if you look into especially like even some modern egregores, it's like like I said at the beginning, there's an egregore for the internet now. It's like in basically every way, shape, and form, it's a functional god at this point. There are people there are forums and cults and covens online that worship this thing as a god. People make offerings to it, they interact with it, they have channeled writings from it, all that kind of thing. So in every single way, it kind of behaves in the same function as a traditional god. And then it comes down to how you define entities, whether you're taking more of the kind of mental school, archetypal school approach to things, where it's like, okay, they're not so much individual conscious beings that exist outside of yourself, they're more archetypes or currents that exist in the collective unconscious that you interact with, and there are arguments for that. Or whether you see them in the more traditional sense of the word, or a word of entity, where it's like there are actual beings that exist independent of yourself, in which case maybe the nuance and the line between the two is it's like there is, I don't know what we call it, there is the consciousness, there is the actual energy of themselves, but the body, quote unquote, that consciousness then inhabits is created by us. It's created by the cultural medium that we're around, and we give them space, I guess to say, to inhabit. That's kind of like my middle ground, how I see things. I mean, it depends. Like you said, you don't really know, but like, where do you fall on the spectrum? Do you tend to fall more towards the entities are individual beings, or like archetypes? Do you think?
I think both. Yes, that's my answer. Yes, because I have met spirits who were definitely sentient beings. They came down and they were sentient, right? Like I've been exposed to that. I've also experienced things with created folklore figures, legendary figures, right? who have a definitive hold over the landscape, and you feel it. Like a lot of the characters from a Mabinogion from Wales, right? They are, for all the intents and purposes, these individuals are characters in a medieval story, and they may have, because of etymology, been connected with ancient deities, but they're not presented that way in these stories. And yet you have experiences with them. King Arthur, or go to Sherwood Forest, and you know, wandering around what is left of Sherwood Forest, and you could swear that Robin Hood would be coming around the corner at any moment, because so much attention, so much interest, and so much has been placed onto those legendary figures, even if they didn't actually exist. They exist because we make them exist, right? And so I'm kind of caught in between. I've experienced both. I'm not prepared to limit myself anymore, and I think that's where I'm at in my life. Like I'm open, you know. Just don't come and fuck with me, right? You know.
But it's also one of those things. It reminds me, as much as I don't like to use the sort of the anthropological definition of things, when you look into sort of anthropological definitions of magic, because like magic, as weird as it sounds to people who are listening to this, like as much as academia and stuff doesn't believe in magic as an empirical actual thing, it is still studied in anthropological circles. Like the anthropology of ritual and witchcraft is still a very valid thing in academia. It still happens, but it's mostly studied in the context of like pre-industrial societies or sort of indigenous societies and tribal chiefdoms and that kind of thing. But it's always really funny because one of the main definitions of it is that even though magic doesn't, or they don't believe magic has empirical effects in that you do something and it actually happens, it's still, or they do still acknowledge, or the vast majority of anthropologists do still acknowledge that magic has a social effect. Regardless of whether it has an empirical effect, it has a social one, in that if somebody, and this also applies to archaeology a little bit, where you go back into the ancient world, if we look at the PGM again, for example, and there's like invisibility spells. PGM. If somebody goes and does an invisibility spell from PGM, they are going to have, whether it's an increased level of confidence to be able to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do at that point in their life, at any point. Well, they will do things and they will create things and engage in things that they otherwise wouldn't do. And they're doing that because of their belief in magic, or they're doing that because by proxy magic, basically. So regardless of whether the person is invisible or not, whether the spell actually worked and had an empirical effect, is kind of irrelevant in anthropological circles, because it still has an effect. It still has a social effect on the culture, on the person, on the individual, and to a certain extent on their state of mind and their state of consciousness and how they interact with it. So it's not as nuanced as people just saying, you know, magic isn't real, it's not science, that kind of thing, or anything like that. Like it has no effect, because it has, like, it comes down to how you define the word effect ultimately, right? And what happens with all of that.
Very much so.
But yeah, it's
well, and so I know we're a little over time, I'm sure, but it's okay. I'm loving.
Yeah, we can start wrapping up. It's been going for a while.
So this is the thing where I have a big issue with academia, and I'm currently in academia, and I'm shouting and screaming to get my way over. The issue is that even in the empirical process, right, it is still a lens that people are using. You are still referring to your five senses, right? I have had experiences in my life that defy explanation, and that's the point. They defy explanation. I'll just show you this. So, as a reminder to myself of that magic is real, I got this tattooed onto my. You can't really see it.
Oh yeah, was it the web of words, isn't it? Yeah.
The web of weird, exactly. So I have had so many experiences in my life where things have happened very quickly and without explanation. One example, right? I am working over in the UK. I'm working in East Sussex at Hurstmonceux Castle 12 years ago, which is a satellite campus for a university in Canada here. So I'm working with a load of Canadian kids and mostly British staff, right? My sister lives up near Chester, up in that area, up near North Wales there. So one of my colleagues is going to go to up north to a hen party and one weekend, and she's really excited about it. And like, you know, we're all the way down in the middle of like southern England, right? So she goes up to this hen party. I have no idea where she's going. My sister happens to have a hen party as well that weekend. And I'm going through my sister's photos the next day after she posts photos. We go to Raceway. And wouldn't you know that just sitting behind my sister in one of the photos is my colleague? What are the odds? And that happened multiple times. This has happened multiple times on that trip. I was walking in Dieppe. I'm walking with two of the Canadian students, and one of them turns to me and says, "Oh, by the way, do you know blah, blah, blah?" I'm like, "Yes," because this person went to my university the year before. And they say, "Oh, we knew her at the previous university she was at. We were her roommates."
Yeah.
Right? What is that? There are so many connections between us, and this is why weird is such an important term for me. It's a reclaimed word that I found for myself to refer to this form of work and relationship. If you're only looking through the scientific method of like invisibility, for example, if you're only looking at that through that and looking at the person and saying, okay, well, they are still visible because I'm looking at them, that denies then the option and the opportunity that if somebody casts an invisibility spell on themselves, they'll be clouded from view. You could walk down a busy street and no one will see you because they're not focusing on you. That's the magic. Yeah. You're not literally turning invisible, but in their view, because we're only seeing a slice of reality, they might perceive you, but they might not focus on you. That's the invisibility, right? Mm. So I think that's, for me, where I'm at with that, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things. I think I guess we can start wrapping up with this yes. Statement, I guess. It's always funny to me because people or everyone who sort of immediately defaults to saying, "Oh, magic's not real, witchcraft doesn't exist." I'm like, have you tried it?
Exactly.
Like, have you actually done it and actually seen what happens? It's like, and I guarantee you, 9 out of 10 times they haven't. Like when people come to you and they immediately go, "Witchcraft's not real," I'm like, okay. Talk me through it. Have you actually done anything to actually engage that kind of behavior? And never. They never do it. And then they'll say, okay, then like when they start to take that perspective, they'll go to like witch talk or something like that, and they'll do like they'll light a candle and that's it. They'll light a single candle, like put their hands together or something like that, and they'll go and do whatever. And then they wonder why it doesn't work. And it's like, okay, what like look at this entire tradition. You're looking at like a tradition that goes back thousands and thousands of years that you need to be initiated into, you need training in, you need to do all this kind of stuff, and yet you're denying it entirely because it doesn't fit with your belief system or your narrative of things. And it's like, we even see the same issue with like translators in ancient texts, right? So I use the PGM as an example, right? So the Greek Magical Papyri. The guy that translated it, or the group of people that translated it, Betts and sort of a lot of the other translators, they are all academics, so they're all sort of I don't know whether they're quite atheists, but they don't believe in magic, so they're translating it from an academic perspective.
They compartmentalize, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the problem you have with it is they are all like, when you come at it with that bias, they kind of take that approach that because it's magic and it's not real, they kind of don't have to try as hard because it doesn't matter because it's just magic. No one really cares, right? Problem you have when you look at the PGM, there are over, I don't know, 60 odd different types of magic, all of which have different procedures. They have different preparations. They have different incenses, different methods, different things, and they all produce different results. Cool. And the thing with it is you look in the papyri and 9 times out of 10, the magician or the author has written like the type of spell next to the title or next to the ritual there. It tells you what it is. But what they do is, because magic's not real, is they just translate all those titles as spell or charm or whatever, or they translate amulet, phylactery, talisman as the same word, charm. It's like when it's such an incredible bias, and it hurts the study of it so much because if you're coming at it from a practitioner's point of view, you're lost. Unless you read ancient Greek and you can go back to the original papyri, you can't do anything because the translation you're working off, like constructing an amulet and a talisman and a phylactery, they are 3 entirely different procedures that require different methods, different things, all of it, and yet they're all translated as charm or spell. And it's like really annoying. But even then, if you come at it from an academic perspective, it's still hurting the entire study of it because it gives us this impression that magic doesn't have a vocabulary, that there's
We're
nothing.
removing the context, right? The original
Right.
context.
Exactly. And it's like when you realize that magic does have a vocabulary, that there is like an entire set of principles and procedures here, like it fleshes the system out way more, and it really actually makes it, in my opinion, way more interesting, because you can look into it and you're like, wow, like this isn't just like, there's an entire world here that we don't ever talk about, or no one talks about outside of these like really niche circles. So it's such an interesting thing. But yeah, it's a shame, you know, it's a shame that people when they bring biases and stuff to it. But
and that's the thing, it's like whenever you're entering into anything, that I mean, one of my minors right now is religious studies, and that is being the most egregious issue with religious studies, is outsiders coming into a tradition and seeing it through their lens. One could argue that the very definition of religion in general is an issue, because it was created from looking at Christianity and then deciding, okay, these are the key features. Okay, there needs to be a founder, there needs to be a book, there needs to be this, that, and all the other, right? Instead of seeing something as it is. But that's the thing with language, and that's one last piece around that, memory, coming back to all of it. When our brains are symbolic creatures, when we have a word that we can make tangent the intangible, then we're limiting it, but we're also able to grasp it, right? So it's like, you know, yeah, it's an issue. It's something that we're just going to have to deal with as humans until we evolve to a point where we're not having to deal with it. Oh, you've gone off.
There you go. Yeah, once we eventually sort of transcend rationality and we don't need to work down here anymore, you know, that'll be the fun part when everything starts happening, I guess.
I'm already working on becoming the next Eon, so.
Wow, yeah. I got no arguments here. But yeah, you know, it'll be fun. You know, I think again, it's a continual journey as we're going through. But no, we'll get there eventually. The more we start doing podcasts, the more we talk about, the more we let people know. You know, the
well, this is the thing. We are in a really great age for this. We have the internet. There's communication all over the place. There's some amazing books coming out. Well, a lot of amazing books coming out, and we have some really decent connection points. There's so many more conferences going on now. There's a whole stream, like there's a Facebook group I belong to, Researching Paganisms, which also includes magic and whatnot, where they are both practitioners and also scholars. So we have our own scholars who are looking into these things. It's getting there, but there's also the danger of too much information too, right? So
yeah, absolutely. All right, well, I think we can probably call it there at this point. So Ben, thank you so much for coming on, man.
Absolutely, this was fun. I mean, reaching out to a stranger, and when you said, you know, who wants to be on my podcast, I'm like, yeah, I'll be on your podcast. Why not? It's been really nice to chat with you.